Get ready for the comeback. The 6 is in revival. Let's show love, TO, and begin a new cycle. Toronto is a delicacy, a huge potluck where the taste of the world emerges to create one dish. You can travel the world exploring the city, glimpsing the globe one subway stop at a time. Here, diversity is embraced and every culture shines. Here, your vibe attracts your tribe when your steps have aligned, just like the letters of the Toronto sign. Together we'll rise, like the CN Tower against our skyline. We've missed you, and there's so much more we want to show. Consider this your invitation to make your destination TO.
Hello and welcome to Toronto. My name is Leslie Wu, CEO with Civic Action. Over the last 18 years, Civic Action has been committed to building better, more inclusive cities. And no one is more important to the future of our cities than those who lead. They come from all sectors, all lived experiences, and together we find bold solutions for our urban region's biggest challenges. And that's why I'm delighted today to kick off World City 2021. We're here at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre, and I'm joined by none other than the Mayor of Toronto, John Tory. Mayor Tory has long been an advocate for a livable and sustainable Toronto. In a one-on-one conversation, together we will dig into the question, how can we make sure that cities come back stronger than ever for all citizens in a post-pandemic era? Mayor Tory, welcome, and thank you for joining us at World City 2021.
I'm happy to be at this year's version. Thank you, Leslie.
Okay, so let's get going. COVID-19 has been seismic and presented challenges to cities around the world that we never saw coming. It required unique and scalable approaches from governments at every level. Now, governments are not known for being the most innovative necessarily or the most quick to respond, but that was not the case here in Toronto. What do you think were the key ingredients to the city's agility and now subsequent transformation?
Well, there's nothing like, an emergency to focus the mind on getting things done. And I described the way in which our city responded to things as wartime speed. And, if you think back to previous crises that we've had in cities and countries, over decades, when wartime was on or something that was an emergency, people do respond. And so in this case, our public service, for example, responded magnificently, and did things in a much faster time frame. And, we did it without the consultants and without the studies and without the reports. And yes, there's something that's lost in that you don't have the time to necessarily hear all the points of view you might want to hear. But at the same time, we had an emergency on our hands. The second thing I would say that was vital to our success at being more nimble and more agile and more, speedy about these things was partnerships. We didn't assume that government had to do it all. In fact, the opposite assumption was made, which is that we were better off to reach out to some of our social service, community engagement, organizations across the city and form partnerships with them. And it was vital because what it meant was that we sort of had the resources, we had the know-how in terms of local service delivery, but we relied on those organizations that do it every day to actually help us deliver whatever the service was, whether it was food security or whether it was caring for seniors or, a lot of it had to do with caring for the most vulnerable people that needed extra support during a pandemic.
Amazing, and I know that even within, not only in the initiatives that happened, but the research the city staff did to be able to really focus in on how to address the pandemic was remarkable. Now, Build Back Stronger is a key phrase that's being tossed around everywhere. And as we look ahead, how will you and your council use the lessons from the last 18 months? Lessons for projects and policies that were really built just for the moment. And so how do we now create a more robust future for Toronto?
Well, I will say to you that my answer would depend on the other governments recognizing the merits of what I'm about to say, because they too, helped us and recognized the efficacy, the merits of these partnerships with local organizations, and they, I think, to an extent never before seen, recognize the legitimacy of local government. For those who are from outside of Canada, our Constitution doesn't even recognize cities or municipalities as existing in any constitutional way. And this has, I think, led to a diminished perception of what that level of government can do and does every day, which is deliver things on a very local, targeted, neighborhood by neighborhood basis, services that you have no choice but to deliver. You don't have the choice of, being late when it comes to delivering water to people or making sure they're fed or housed. And so I hope that the other governments recognize the legitimacy that was demonstrated during an emergency like this of local government and of the partnerships it can very quickly form. I think the second thing for us is to maintain those partnerships in place. If you saw that you were able to deal with issues like food security, emergency housing, and so on better in partnership with, with organizations that are local, then why wouldn't you keep doing that? Because, and we often did in the past, but sometimes we didn't do it to the extent we did during the pandemic. And I think that's going to be important to sort of building back better. And then I think some of the rest of it is going to be to continue on, perhaps even with a greater sense of urgency, with some of the things we'd begun to do before the pandemic, such as in the case of our own city, and it's true, I think, of many big, successful, growing global cities, which is an affordability problem with respect to housing, for example. We were at work on initiatives to kind of speed up our productivity in that area before the pandemic. And now I think we've got to, redouble our efforts because we've seen during the pandemic that, a lack of affordable housing is a key to not just the rest of how you live your life because you have less money left over after you pay your rent, but also to the likelihood, therefore, that you will get sick or that you will need other kinds of supports in something like a pandemic. And so these were lessons that were not brand new, but I think they were put into stark relief by the pandemic. And so I think a lot of those things, continued legitimacy of local government, continued partnerships by local government in service delivery, and carrying on with some of the things we had begun, poverty reduction, affordable housing, in a kind of an even more intensive way, just because they hold the key to kind of lifting people out of a vulnerable state that they proved to be in when the pandemic started.
And I know even in neighborhoods, lots of transformation has happened. And talk a little bit about how going forward, things, a little bit about active TO, cafe TO. There have been some remarkable initiatives that you and under your leadership and council for the audiences around the world to understand how transformative that has really been for Torontonians.
Well, I don't know what the state of affairs is in other cities because I'm constantly being told about different cities that have done things faster than we have done them. But here, there's a sensitivity to how you divide up public space, say, on a street between the front of the building on one side and the front of the building on the other. And you have sidewalks and you have, bicycle infrastructure and you have infrastructure for cars and transit vehicles and you have transit rights of way and so forth. And there's been quite a debate about that. The active TO, all in the interest of safety, active TO is what we called our program where we repurposed some of that space, sometimes on a full-time basis every day of every week and other times on weekends, so as to give people a safe, healthy place where they could be outside. Because one of the things we learned early on in the pandemic is if you're out of doors and you can be out of doors at a distance from one another, that was safer than if you were either outdoors close together or indoors. And so we repurposed a lot of streets and a lot of sidewalk space. We put something in place called café-TO, which was, again, an attempt to make sure restaurants could stay in business so that people had the opportunity to eat out of doors, which you can't do every month of the year here in Toronto, but you can do it many months of the year. And what we found was not only did those serve a purpose in terms of the health, the collective health of people and helping us get through the pandemic, but it also was very enjoyable for people. They enjoyed using the public space to ride their bike or push their stroller. They enjoyed eating in these cafes that were outdoors where we had a lot more capacity by adding this cafe space. I mean, people in European cities would sort of say, well, there's nothing new about having all that outdoor cafe space. Well, for us it was. And for us, we had 2 years in a row the greatest addition of bike infrastructure in the history of the city. And so the question now is, how do we make those things more permanent? And that will be the subject of a review we will do quickly, while the winter is on. And that's my hope that we can make a lot of that changes that are permanent, done, in the right way with the right degree of study of the facts as to what impact it had, both positive and otherwise. But I think now we did learn some lessons from that as to how you can have this kind of safe, healthy infrastructure, but also have it as something that's a great joy to the people who live in the city as times change and as people get around and entertain themselves in different ways.
I know as a Torontonian, and I know many of my friends, family, and acquaintances re-experienced the city, even though we were in lockdown, and rediscovered parks, rediscovered open spaces, found local restaurants that we probably never would have necessarily been at had we been in a different situation. So
I did too. I mean, I found, one of the things you did when you were not able to do anything else because the theaters were closed, the restaurants were closed, and there was that terrible period of lockdown, is you'd go for a walk. And so there's only so many times you can walk around your own block. And so sometimes you might drive your car to another part of the city, which I didn't. I've probably seen more of the city than most people because I'm the mayor. But we drove and had these walks to places I'd never seen before. And I think it was a great way that people did get more in touch with their city. And I think a lot of people have maintained doing that, even though some of the restrictions on other forms of entertainment are off now. And we added to that by making some of this infrastructure for biking and otherwise available, putting more washrooms into the parks and, doing different things we could do to sort of accommodate that. And I think, again, those will become more permanent features of how we live going forward because we've seen both that it can be done, but also the joy that it creates as well as the good health.
Yeah, and in fact, one would say that there's a whole new appreciation of parks and public space in the City of Toronto. For many, it is one of the key elements that makes this place a more inclusive city is because of the access to public open space. And so we hear people talk now about the economy and the recovery driving towards it being more inclusive. How do we reimagine the future shape of the city to ensure the lessons we've learned in 2020, 2021 about the status and the gaps that exist within our city, that the recovery will include everyone, especially those who have been historically left behind?
Well, I think the most challenging area, and I don't have the answer, but I think we know we have to come up with one, is economic inclusion. I've talked to people in the far corners of the city who are often from newcomer groups, and they will talk about how this huge tech boom we've enjoyed, fantastic investment that even carried on through the pandemic, from global companies coming here and from our own startups. And yet a lot of those people would say their kids who've gone to university or college and have the requisite education are not being included because they just don't have the same channels, the same pathways in. And I think that's a huge issue we have to come to grips with better, and that's going to require the cooperation of business and labor and government working together. I think with respect to other challenges, it is going to be a matter of maintaining those partnerships. I think accepting as a city and as a population that we actually go along with targeted help and not assume everything has to be universal. I mean, that's another lesson we've learned is that we've done, way disproportionate support and effort in areas where it was needed the most. And nobody disputed that because they could see there were people who were suffering more from COVID, suffering more from, dislocation caused by COVID. And nobody took objection to the fact that we spent a lot more of our resources there helping those people. Whereas normally in this country, there's a great sort of hue and cry, and this will be one thing I'll say that'll be slightly more controversial, about everything having to be universal. And I just don't accept that, and I've learned that lesson again in COVID, that we're going to be more effective at dealing with those who need help the most if we supply help to those who need help the most, or supply more help for them than perhaps for other people, and so who don't need that help. So I think that's a lesson that will help us build back better. I think, the key to all of this at the end of the day is going to be a strong, healthy economy, because I am a believer, and again, some will disagree with this, that the fundamental way in which you deal with getting better housing or being able to afford better housing, being able to afford to clothe and feed your children is by having a good, secure job. And that comes back to the first point. And so I think that, we've learned a number of lessons, including the fact that there are groups that are very vulnerable that need continuous care and support out there. And we've got to, take the lessons we learned from the pandemic where we supplied that support and help. But I think a lot of it as well is making sure that the economy is inclusive to a greater extent than it has been, because I'm not sure we were doing as good a job on that at the time the city was booming before the pandemic, which it will do again.
Yeah. In fact, one would argue that hopefully as a city and a region we have become more empathetic. And so I think the silver lining should be that we find ourselves being a bit more empathetic to everyone all around us, and therefore more inclusive.
And I think people also maybe came to the conclusion that government can't do everything. I think that in a lot of these Western liberal societies, of which Canada is one, we have a very activist role, and rightly so, for government. But I think people have come to realize more, perhaps during the pandemic, government can't do everything. Government can't possibly hire enough people to go to knock on the door of every senior and say, "Are you okay? Can I get you some food?" When they can't go out of their apartments. and on. You could give 100 examples like that. And I think we've seen that government has a very useful role to play coordinating all this and funding some of it, but that people looking after other people was fundamental to our success. It's the thing I'm proudest of, in the pandemic, is that people stepped up through organizations or individually to knock on the door of their neighbor or to look after their mother, their aging mother or whatever, and a lot of these kinds of things. And I think it proved that point, which is that, there was more empathy because there had to be. I mean, I think people sort of recognized if it wasn't them, it would be nobody, and that was not acceptable. And I think we saw a huge wave of people being engaged in their community, which is, I know, something, Civic Action from the beginning has promoted. And I just hope that lesson isn't lost, that people stay engaged, because there's a way in which we can multiply the efforts of government many times over by having people, individual citizens and residents, step up.
No, it's amazing. I mean, I think about the work that what started as an ad hoc group, the Vaccine Hunters, how many people they supported and helped, and in a collaborative way with the public health officials and so forth. It was a very good example of that very fact of the collaboration and the ability to work together, and that no one organization, no one government can do it on their own.
And when they, Vaccine Hunters, by the way, were offered money for what they had been doing, they turned it down.
Yes.
You never hear of that kind of thing, but you did from them. They just stepped up and said, no, we did this to make for a better place and for better health and better vaccination, and they turned down the money.
It was remarkable. So another thought here. Toronto was actually one of the cities around the world that was in lockdown for the longest, particularly when we compare ourselves to North America. And yet our recovery, which I believe we're in our recovery, and I think most indicators show we're in recovery, is underway. Why do you think this is? And what advice would you give to other cities?
Well, I mean, I think the reason that we're in a recovery is because all the fundamentals were there. I don't think it so much relates to how many days of lockdown we had or didn't have. There are some who argue that the additional days of lockdown we had did more damage and made the recovery harder. I'm not one of those. I think we relied on public health advice, and that was key, by the way, in all of this, is relying on public health advice as opposed to political advice. And I think that was important. But I think that, really what helped us to start to recover faster, because we were nowhere near the end of the recovery, or, we're just getting started with it, is the fundamentals being there, the talented people, the empathy that does exist there, which was a feature of Toronto and Canadian cities before the pandemic. The people looked after each other and got engaged in their community. The confidence the rest of the world has in our way of life. I think those had far more to do, because those I don't think really ever diminished. I could tell from sitting in my office doing virtual kind of trade missions where I would reach out to companies that were looking at investing in Toronto, and their interest in the fundamentals of Toronto and what it represented was just as high as before the pandemic, and they sort of assumed we'd get through it. We then had terrific efforts on vaccination, which I do give credit to our own city government and to the other governments and to the health sector for, and our own leadership. We had terrific efforts at supporting people, which meant we were better positioned to come out of the pandemic into a robust kind of recovery, which I hope we're in now. But I think a lot of it, really just was the fundamentals still being here, and that people always never lost sight of the fact this is one of the most attractive places in the world to live and to invest and to create jobs. And even during the pandemic, but the minute it started to look like it was going to be over, they started to call again and email. And when the borders open, I think we're going to be booming again, just because people want to come here. And I'm not boasting or bragging about that. I'm just saying that's something that it makes you focus very much on wanting to stay that way. Address the affordable housing issue, make sure you address climate change issues, make sure people know of our way of life here where we respect each other no matter what your background is, and so on, that you keep those fundamentals in place. Make sure you have a huge pipeline of public education that's producing more and more talented people, and that you invite the best and the brightest to come here and embrace them when they get here, no matter where they come from or what they look like or who they love or any of that stuff. You just say, no, we want you to come here and be part of this great enterprise we have going here in Canada.
So a lot has happened in the last 18 months. What was your most proudest moment or thing that you felt your heart lift the highest? Because there were some dark times.
Oh yeah.
But maybe, because I'm an optimist, love to hear things that, looking back, you're really, really proud of.
People stepping up, for each other. I mean, because you see that, you see every year there are different campaigns that go on and different efforts. And when there's an emergency, we had some terrible tragedies here over the last 3 or 4 years, where people stepped up hugely to donate money and help their neighbors and all the rest. heal the city. But I think people stepped up in unprecedented numbers, and for a long time. It wasn't for a week or a month, it was for like 18 months, and it's still going on. I think I'm proud of that. I'm very proud of our vaccination effort, both the effort that was made to deliver the vaccinations, but also the cooperation of people in getting the vaccinations. We put on the board, we're not the biggest city in the world, but we're a big city, and we're a complicated city because of diversity and a lot of hesitation people had for different reasons over time. And we've nonetheless done quite well. It's still a work in progress as we speak, but we've done well posting numbers that are respectable relative to any other global city in the world. And I think that's people saying, we are putting the collective good, the collective health of our neighbors and coworkers and families ahead of any hesitation that we have. And not everybody's yet done that, but lots of people have. And I think that's something to be very proud of, because I think it, over the the medium and long term, will pay huge dividends for those people, but for the city and for the country.
And as you think about not only the pandemic, because we've talked a lot about the pandemic, but there was a conflation of many issues. There was a pandemic, there was the incident in the States, the George Floyd murder. Clearly, when we talk about the last 18 months being seismic, it infers a lot of terrible things happen. And but I'm an optimist, and I believe that the way forward for the future of the city is going to build on our experience for the last 18 years. What do you think young, emerging, rising leaders in this city, how would the last 18 months have changed their view? Or do you think that they are still staying, their desire to change the status quo? Do you think that the last 18 months combined all other else that was happening in the world is changing our view of leaders? We're talking to an audience from around the world. Do you think that is has shifted? I mean, we were in a good place before.
Yeah, I think a lot of those people you're talking about, particularly younger people, are looking for more proactivity. They're looking for more nimble, demonstrations of kind of being nimble. They're looking for a faster pace of progress. If you look at the issues prompted by and they weren't new issues, but I guess the point is the George Floyd and a series of other incidents caused us to sort of put down some really, much more tangible markers as to what we were going to do and within what time frame we were going to do it. I think that the existence of a pandemic, which laid bare a lot of people who really were struggling to begin with, and then they struggled even more to the point of, in some case, having higher loss of life and higher loss of sickness, that it means you should sort of move on your affordable housing, poverty reduction efforts, faster and have, again, more goals. So I think that's really what it's done, if anything. Even climate change. Climate change, if you look at it, is going to be no different than a pandemic in that it will have more severe impact on people who are struggling than it will on people who are well off. And so, I think that the message that's coming to us is get on with it. And do the things that have to be done. We've learned how to do some of those differently because of our positive experiences during the pandemic, but just get on with it. And don't spend, yes, consult and please make sure our voices are heard, but make sure you get on with things and don't take forever to do things that need to be done.
You mentioned earlier that one of the key things the City of Toronto did was, and you as the mayor and the council, was listen to the professionals, listen to the chief medical officers of health, listen to the experts. Public health did an amazing job of trying to identify where the hotspots were, and then your resources were directed, as you described, to those places. Are there other examples within the city when you talk about issues like housing and so forth, that probably that lesson learned, there is the ability of the city to apply this rational notion of getting data, analysis, and informing discourse?
Every area.
Yeah.
Every area, because that's what we did. We collected a lot of data. We partnered with these local organizations, and of course we learned something we knew before, but it reinforced it, that people trust local people they're used to dealing with, whether it's people at their church or people in their neighborhood group or people at their community health center. They trust those people. They know those people. And so you can use those people as, and I mean use in the most positive way, as a channel to convey information, to reassure people, to support people. And I think we learned that, and then I think we learned from a lot of better use of data, as you mentioned, how to target support, because otherwise you're dealing, our city's not the biggest of those who are watching, but it's 3 million people. It's spread out over a big area. And the fact is that in a crisis, you've got to go to the hot spots first. And that wasn't just medical hotspots, those were social hotspots. Those were vaccine hesitant hotspots. They were a number of different things. And so I think we did learn a lot, and I hope that's an approach that sort of embeds itself. I mean, it was used to an extent before, but I think we learned about using it more going forward to, as I said earlier on, target and not have people dissent from that notion that you go first where the problem is worst and apply yourself very directly and energetically to that problem area, and then you can help to lift those people out of probably the impoverished circumstances that leave them more vulnerable.
So in thinking about all that you've put in front of us, the success of the ability to navigate, and the success has been around bringing together the physical space, the public policy elements, the community having a role, government having a role. It's a lot, and it's from a system standpoint. And first of all, very grateful that you were in the leadership position you were to lead us through that effort. So I would like to thank you for all your insights. Thank you for everyone from around the world who's joining us at World City. We can't wait to welcome others to Toronto once again, whether it's their first time or their 100th time. They're always welcome. So enjoy the rest of the Toronto program to all the viewers, and enjoy the World City Conference. And thank you again.
Thank you, Leslie.